The winter wind moved across the Texas plains like a living thing. It was the kind of cold that bit through heavy coats, the kind of cold that made the air feel sharp in the lungs. Snow covered the open land, smooth and white, stretching for miles in every direction. The few trees stood still like quiet guards, their bare branches shining with frost. It was the winter of 1868, and the land was quiet except for the sound of the wind and the soft creak of wood from the small cabins scattered here and there. Martha Caldwell stood near the window of her tiny log cabin, holding a cup of warm tea in both hands. She was in her mid-20s, with kind eyes that often carried a gentle light even in the darkest times. Her dark brown hair was tied back in a simple braid, and her wool dress was patched at the elbows but clean and neatly kept. Life on the frontier was not easy, but Martha had grown used to the rhythm of the land. She loved the quiet mornings, the smell of wood smoke and the way the sky turned golden when the sun rose over the snow. Her husband, James, was outside chopping wood. He was strong and quiet, a man of few words but good heart. Martha often watched him work in the cold and wondered how they had both ended up in this wide, wild land. Just a few years earlier, they had lived in a busy town back east surrounded by neighbors, shops, and warm fireplaces. But James had always dreamed of building a life on his own land, far from the crowded towns. So they packed their few belongings, traveled west, and built their cabin on the edge of the plains. Now, their world was made of the land around them, the cabin, the barn, the frozen river a short walk away, and the endless open sky. That winter had come early. The first snow fell before the end of October, and by late November the storms were strong and endless. Many settlers in the area spoke of the harsh season ahead. The nearest town was miles away, and the journey was difficult, especially with snow covering the trails. Martha and James stored as much food and firewood as they could, but every storm made the world feel smaller, more closed in. When the wind howled at night, it felt as though the whole world had been reduced to the walls of their small cabin. But even in the middle of these hard months, Martha found beauty. She loved standing at the door in the early morning, wrapped in a blanket, watching the sunlight touch the snow. She loved listening to the distant cry of wild geese flying overhead. She loved the silence too, a silence so deep she could hear the sound of her own heartbeat. The cabin itself was small but warm. James had built it with his own hands. There was a stone fireplace on one side, a small table in the middle, 2 wooden chairs, and a bed tucked against the far wall. Every corner of the house carried their work. The shelves were lined with jars of preserved food. A single lantern hung near the door. They had learned to live with less, and they were proud of what they had made together. Yet under that calm surface there was always a quiet sense of caution. Martha had heard stories from other settlers about how fragile life could be in this place. The weather could change quickly, turning clear skies into raging storms in just a few hours. Wild animals roamed the plains at night. And then there were the tensions between the settlers and the Comanche people, who had lived on this land long before Martha and others like her came west. Some settlers spoke with fear, others with anger. Martha listened but kept her thoughts to herself. She had never met a Comanche person face to face, but she did not believe they were as cruel as the stories claimed. She knew deep down that people everywhere had their own lives, their own families, and their own hearts. That evening, the snow began to fall again. It started with a few quiet flakes tapping softly against the window. Then the wind picked up. Within an hour the air was thick with white, and the world outside disappeared behind the swirling snow. James came in from the cold, stamping his boots on the wooden floor, his cheeks red from the wind. Martha hurried to take his coat and hang it by the fire. They sat down to a simple dinner of bread, beans, and hot tea. The fire crackled softly as the storm grew stronger outside. "Looks like it's going to be a bad one," James said quietly, looking toward the window. Martha nodded, wrapping her shawl a little tighter around her shoulders. "We'll be all right," she said. "We've gotten through worse." James gave a small smile. "We have," he agreed. After dinner, Martha cleaned the table while James added more logs to the fire. The flames grew brighter, throwing warm light on the wooden walls. The storm outside howled louder now, the kind of sound that made the house feel both safe and small at the same time. Martha went to the window again and looked out. She couldn't see anything except the snow swirling in thick white waves. It was close to midnight when Martha was awakened by a strange sound. At first she thought it was only the wind, but then it came again. Soft, faint, almost lost in the storm. A cry. It was high and thin, like the sound of a small child or an animal in trouble. She sat up, listening carefully. There it was again. A cry in the blizzard. James was still asleep, breathing deeply. Martha slipped out of bed and went to the window. All she saw was white. The cry came once more, and this time she knew it was real. She hesitated for only a moment. Her heart was beating fast, but something inside her told her she couldn't ignore it. She wrapped herself in her thick wool coat, pulled on her boots, and lit a lantern. The wind hit her face the second she opened the door, sharp and cold like a knife. The snow was up to her knees, and the light from the lantern only reached a few feet in front of her. But she kept walking toward the sound. The night was so quiet that the tiny cry seemed to fill the world. Step by step, she moved away from the cabin, her boots sinking into the snow. She called out softly, but her voice was swallowed by the wind. Then, just beyond the fence, she saw it, a small bundle half covered in snow. Her breath caught in her chest. She hurried forward and knelt down. It was a baby. The child was wrapped in animal hide, so thin that the cold had already crept through. The baby's face was red from the freezing air, and its tiny body trembled weakly. Martha's hands shook as she lifted the child into her arms. The baby gave a small cry, weak but alive. She looked around the empty field, but there was no one. No tracks, no horses, no people. The storm had hidden everything. Martha held the child close to her chest to share her warmth and turned back toward the cabin. The wind pushed against her like an invisible wall, but she pressed on step after step until she reached the door. When she stepped inside, the warmth of the fire wrapped around her like a blanket. James woke up at the sound of the door closing. His eyes widened as he saw what she carried. "Martha, what is that?" She didn't answer right away. She carefully unwrapped the bundle and showed him the tiny face. "It's a baby," she whispered. "I found it outside." James sat up, confused. "Whose baby?" "I don't know," she said, but it was alone in the snow. Martha rushed to the fire, wrapped the baby in a wool blanket, and held it close to the flames. She rubbed its tiny hands gently, trying to bring back warmth. The baby's breathing grew steadier. James stood behind her, worried and unsure. The storm still roared outside. No one could have survived out there for long. They both knew this was no ordinary night. Something had changed the moment Martha opened that door. She didn't know where the child had come from, or why it had been left in the snow. But she knew one thing for certain. If she hadn't stepped outside, the baby would not have survived the night. As the storm raged on, Martha sat by the fire, rocking the baby in her arms. She didn't know it yet, but this single act of kindness would echo far beyond that cabin. It would bring strangers to her door, change the way people saw her, and write her name into the quiet history of the land. Martha did not sleep at all that night. She sat in her chair beside the fireplace, gently rocking the baby in her arms. Outside, the storm was still blowing strong, but inside the small cabin, the fire burned bright and steady. The baby's tiny breaths grew stronger as the hours passed. Its little fingers slowly curled around the edge of the blanket. Every now and then, the baby made a soft sound, almost like a whisper, and Martha's heart would squeeze with both fear and tenderness. She looked down at the child again. The animal hide it had been wrapped in was unlike anything she had ever seen up close. It was soft and carefully sewn, with a design made of tiny beads along the edges. This was not a settler's blanket. It was the work of Comanche hands. Martha understood at once that this baby belonged to someone from the Comanche tribe. She also knew that this meant something much larger than just a child at her doorstep. But at that moment, she didn't think about tribes or tensions or danger. She only saw a small, helpless baby who needed warmth and care. She held the baby close, pressing its little body against her chest so it could feel her heartbeat. The baby sighed softly as if it somehow knew it was safe now. James sat on the edge of the bed behind her, watching quietly. He didn't speak much, but Martha could feel the worry in the room like a heavy blanket. He leaned forward and rubbed his hands together. "Martha," he finally said in a low voice, "you know what this means." "Yes," she whispered, her eyes still on the baby. "This is a Comanche child," he said. "If the tribe finds out we have it, they might come here." Martha looked up at him, her eyes calm but firm. "And if I hadn't brought it in, it would have frozen outside," she said softly. "I couldn't leave it there, James. No one could." James ran a hand over his face. He wasn't angry, just worried. Life on the frontier had taught them to be careful, to think before every step. But Martha had a different way of seeing the world. Where James saw risks, she saw lives, and now that life was wrapped in her arms, sleeping against her chest. As the first light of morning touched the snow outside, the storm finally began to ease. The wind grew quiet and a soft stillness filled the land. Martha stood and walked slowly to the window, still holding the baby. The world outside was white and shining like a sheet of glass. Everything looked peaceful, but she knew that somewhere out there someone had lost this child. She spent the next few hours carefully tending to the baby. She warmed a little milk and fed the child slowly with a clean cloth. The baby's eyes opened for the first time, deep brown, warm, and full of life. Martha smiled without even realizing it. She gently touched the child's cheek and the baby blinked up at her as if it was trying to understand this new face. James chopped wood outside for a while, trying to clear his head. He walked to the fence line where Martha had found the bundle the night before. The snow had already covered most of the ground, and any footprints that might have been there were now gone. Whoever had left the baby had done it in silence, and the storm had erased every trace. When James returned, Martha had wrapped the baby in a fresh wool blanket and placed it in a small basket near the fire. She had lined the bottom of the basket with soft cloth so the child would stay warm. She sat next to it, sewing a little patch on one of James's shirts as if nothing extraordinary had happened. But both of them knew things were different now. Later that day, as the sky cleared, a neighbor named Mr. Collins stopped by on horseback. He was an older man with a thick beard and a loud voice. He often rode past their cabin on his way to town. When he saw the snow piled high and the smoke rising from their chimney, he decided to check in. "Morning, James," he called out, pulling his horse to a stop. "That was a nasty storm last night." James forced a polite smile. "Sure was. Coldest one yet?" Mr. Collins climbed down and stomped the snow from his boots. He glanced inside the cabin, and then froze when he saw Martha sitting by the fire with the baby in her arms. His eyebrows shot up. "Well, I'll be—" "What's this?" Martha held the baby closer. "I found the child outside during the storm," she said softly. "All alone." Mr. Collins gave a low whistle. "Outside? In that cold? That's no settler's child. You can tell by the way it's wrapped. That's a Comanche baby." James shifted uncomfortably. Martha simply nodded. "You need to be careful, James," Mr. Collins said in a hushed voice, looking over his shoulder as if someone might hear. "If the tribe's looking for that child, they might come for it. And if they do, there's no telling what they'll do." Martha's back straightened slightly. "They'll come because it's their child," she said, her voice steady but calm. "And when they do, we'll give it back." Mr. Collins looked at her like she had said something foolish. "You're too kind for your own good, Martha. You don't know these people like I do." But Martha didn't answer. She kept her eyes on the baby, who was now sleeping peacefully, wrapped snugly in her wool blanket. After the neighbor left, James closed the door and sat down beside Martha. "You know people will talk," he said gently. "Collins isn't the only one who'll hear about this." "I know," she said quietly. "They might think we're in trouble." Martha finally looked up at him. "We're not in trouble, James. We saved a life. That's all we did." James couldn't argue with that, and somewhere inside him, he felt a quiet pride in his wife's strength. She had always seen the world with softer eyes than most. The next few days passed slowly but peacefully. The snow began to melt a little, though the nights were still cold. Martha cared for the baby as if it had been her own. She kept it close, fed it warm milk, and wrapped it in the softest cloth they had. The little one grew stronger with each passing day. It had a small birthmark near its left shoulder like a tiny star. Martha often traced it gently with her finger as the baby slept, wondering about the mother who must have loved this child deeply. James built a small wooden cradle from spare wood in the barn. It was simple but strong. Martha placed it near the fireplace and lined it with soft fabric. Each night, as the fire crackled and the wind whispered outside, Martha would sit by the cradle humming a soft tune. The baby seemed to recognize her voice, and its tiny hands would curl around her finger. But even in these quiet days, a soft uneasiness hung in the air. Martha and James both knew that somewhere beyond the snow-covered fields someone was searching. The Comanche people did not simply forget their own. Every time a horse's hoof sounded in the distance, Martha felt her heart jump just a little. Every time the wind shifted, James looked toward the horizon. One afternoon, while Martha was hanging clothes by the cabin, she noticed something unusual. A small feather had been tied to the fence post at the far end of their land. It was delicate, with red and white strands woven together. She stared at it for a long time, her heart beating fast. Someone had been there. Someone had found their home. She didn't tell James right away. She walked back slowly to the cabin, her hands cold but her mind clear. The feather wasn't a threat. It was a sign. She didn't know what it meant exactly, but she felt deep down that it was part of the story she had stepped into the night she saved the baby. That evening, she finally told James. He frowned and looked at the fence post in the fading light. "They know," he said quietly. "They know their child is here." Martha nodded. "And they'll come." James looked at her for a long moment. He saw no fear in her face, only calm. Only the same quiet strength that had made him love her years ago. And as night settled over the land once more, the fire burned bright inside their small cabin. The baby slept soundly, warm and safe. Outside, the plains stretched out under the stars, silent and waiting. Something was coming. Neither of them knew what the next days would bring, but they both understood that life on the frontier was never truly quiet for long. The days after the feather appeared on the fence were quiet, almost too quiet. Martha continued to care for the baby with the same gentle hands, but something in the air had changed. Every sound outside felt louder than usual. Every horse's hoofbeat in the distance made both Martha and James stop what they were doing and listen carefully. The land had a stillness to it now, a kind of waiting that neither of them could ignore. The baby, on the other hand, seemed to grow stronger each day. Its cheeks were pink and warm, its tiny hands now reaching out to grasp Martha's finger or the edge of a blanket. In the mornings, Martha would hold the child by the small window so it could feel the sunlight on its face. She didn't know its name, but she often whispered soft words to it as if it were her own. She called the baby Little Star, after the birthmark on its shoulder that reminded her of a star shining through a winter night. James spent more time outside now. He checked the fence line every morning and every evening. He walked farther into the fields, looking for tracks in the soft snow. He didn't speak much about it, but Martha could see the worry in his eyes. He wasn't afraid for himself. He was worried about Martha, and he was worried about what might happen when the baby's people came for it. One afternoon, when the sky was gray and the wind was soft, James returned from his walk with a serious look on his face. Martha was sitting by the fire with the baby, humming a little song. When she saw his expression, she stopped mid-note. "What is it?" she asked quietly. "There are tracks in the snow," he said. "Not animal tracks. Horse tracks. At least a dozen." Martha held the baby closer to her chest. She didn't speak for a moment. Then she nodded slowly. "They're coming." James sat down at the table, removing his gloves. "They haven't come to the door yet, but they're close. Probably watching us." Martha looked at the baby, who blinked up at her with soft brown eyes. She thought about the feather on the fence, placed gently as if to say, "We know." She didn't feel fear exactly. It was more like a weight settling gently on her shoulders. Something important was about to happen. By the next morning, more signs appeared. A thin column of smoke rose far out on the horizon. James saw it first when he went outside to fetch water. He came back in with a quiet voice. "There's a fire out on the ridge. A big one. Not too close, but close enough." Martha wrapped the baby in a wool blanket and stepped outside. The air was cold, but still. In the distance, just beyond the tree line, she could see a faint gray line of smoke rising into the pale winter sky. It was steady and clear. Someone had made that fire on purpose. She didn't panic. Instead, she felt a strange calmness settle over her. She had known this day would come. She had never once thought of keeping the baby from its family. She only wanted to protect it until it could be safely returned. She turned to James. "They're not hiding anymore." James nodded. "They'll be here soon." That afternoon, a rider from the nearby town passed by. He brought with him news that spread quickly between the settlers. Word had reached the town that a Comanche hunting party had lost a child during the storm. People in town were whispering about it, some with fear, others with suspicion. Some believed the tribe would search until they found the child. Others believed they might think the settlers had taken it. Fear had a way of growing faster than truth on the frontier. Martha listened quietly as James spoke with the rider outside. She could hear bits and pieces of the conversation through the door. "You need to be careful," the man was saying. "If they find out you have that baby, they might come here in numbers. Best thing would be to give it to the fort." Martha opened the door slowly and stepped outside with the baby in her arms. "We're not giving this child to anyone but its family," she said softly but clearly. The rider looked at her with wide eyes, as if she had said something foolish. "Ma'am," he began, "you don't understand how serious this is." "I do," she answered. "And that's exactly why I'll give this child back myself." The rider shook his head. "You're braver than most, or maybe just too kind." When he rode away, the air grew quiet again. James looked at Martha and sighed. "You know people will think we're making a mistake." Martha smiled a little, though her heart was beating faster now. "Maybe they will. But doing the right thing isn't always easy." That night, as darkness fell over the plains, the wind carried faint sounds to the cabin. Martha lay awake listening. It wasn't the sound of the storm this time. It was something else, and a distant rhythm, soft at first but growing clearer as the night went on. It was the sound of hooves. James sat up beside her. "Do you hear that?" She nodded slowly. "They're here." They both got out of bed. Martha wrapped the baby in a warm blanket and held it close to her chest. James lit the lantern and placed it near the window. When he looked out, he didn't see anything at first. The night was cold and still. But then, just at the edge of the darkness, small lights appeared, moving steadily toward the cabin. They weren't stars. They were torches. Martha's breath caught in her throat. James set the lantern down and stood beside her at the window. The lights grew brighter. The soft thundering of hooves grew louder. It was like a slow wave moving closer and closer. Within minutes, shapes appeared on the horizon. They were riders, many riders. Martha counted quickly in her mind. 10, 20, maybe more. They moved as one, like shadows on the snow. The baby stirred in her arms, sensing something in the air. James turned to her. "If things turn bad, we'll—" She placed a gentle hand on his arm. "James, listen to me." Her voice was steady, her eyes calm. "We will not meet fear with fear. We will show them we mean no harm." James hesitated, then nodded. He trusted her more than he trusted his own worries. As the riders came closer, the ground seemed to tremble softly beneath their feet. The night was quiet except for the soft rhythm of hooves and the crackle of their torches. Then, when they were only a short distance away, they slowed their horses and came to a stop. Martha could see their faces now, proud and serious, wrapped in warm hides against the cold. She saw the feathers in their hair and the designs painted carefully on their clothing. There must have been nearly 100 of them. James stepped back from the window, his jaw tight, but his hands steady. Martha held the baby closer. The child was awake now, blinking in the lantern light but calm. She kissed the baby's forehead gently, then turned toward the door. "Martha," James began, but she was already walking forward. She opened the door slowly. The cold night air rushed in, sharp and clear. Outside, under the soft glow of moonlight and torchlight, the Comanche warriors sat on their horses, waiting in silence. Martha stepped out into the snow, barefoot, her breath turning to mist in the cold air. She stood there with the baby in her arms, facing them. The leader of the group dismounted. He was tall, wrapped in thick furs, and wore a feathered band around his head. His eyes were deep and steady. He walked forward slowly, with quiet steps that left soft marks in the snow. The rest of the warriors stayed back, watching in silence. Martha did not move. She did not run. She simply stood there, holding the baby gently in her arms. The leader stopped a few feet in front of her. His eyes fell on the child, and something changed in his face. His serious expression softened. Martha saw his shoulders lower, like a man who had carried a heavy weight and suddenly saw hope. The baby made a small sound, and the leader's hand lifted slowly, almost uncertainly. Martha took a small step forward. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. The child belonged to them. This was its family. The air was cold and quiet. Not a single voice broke the silence. The only sound was the soft crackle of the torches and the baby's gentle breathing. And in that moment, something passed between the woman standing in the snow and the leader of the riders. It was not fear. It was not anger. It was something deeper. A quiet understanding that life, even on this harsh frontier, was still precious. The night had grown so still that it felt as if the world was holding its breath. Martha stood at the doorway. The cold snow beneath her bare feet, the baby warm and safe in her arms. 100 Comanche riders sat silently on their horses. their faces calm but watchful, their torches glowing softly in the dark. The wind had quieted down and even the trees seemed to be listening. The leader of the group stood a few feet away from her. His presence was strong, but there was a quiet kindness in the way he looked at the child. His eyes were fixed on the baby, and Martha could see a world of emotion in them. Relief, love, and something deeper that words could not describe. It was clear that this was no ordinary child. This was someone's heart, someone's hope, someone's family. James stood just inside the doorway, his hands steady but his heart pounding. He trusted Martha, even when he didn't fully understand her courage. He knew that this moment was bigger than both of them. This wasn't about fear or danger anymore. It was about trust. The leader took one careful step forward. The snow crunched softly beneath his boots. Martha didn't move back. She stood still, holding the baby so that the light from the torches touched its tiny face. The baby blinked and let out a small sound, a soft little sigh that seemed to float into the cold air like a whisper. Martha saw the leader's eyes glisten in the firelight. His hand rose slowly, not rushing, not demanding, just reaching. His fingers trembled slightly, and for the first time she saw not a warrior, not a stranger, but a father. She stepped closer, closing the distance between them until they were just a few feet apart. The leader paused as if to make sure she was not afraid. Martha gave a small nod, her expression calm and open. With great care, she lifted the baby a little higher in her arms, cradling it so the man could see clearly. The torchlight danced gently over the child's round face. The leader took a slow breath and then, with a quiet, almost sacred touch, he placed his hands beneath the baby. For a heartbeat, both their hands held the child together. The warmth of the baby rested between them. No words were spoken, but something powerful passed through the cold air. It was a kind of respect that didn't need language. A silent promise, a thank you without sound. Then gently Martha let go. The baby settled into the man's strong arms with a soft, sleepy sigh. The leader held the child as though the world itself had been returned to him. His shoulders lifted, his chest rose, and his eyes closed for a brief moment as if he were breathing again for the first time since that stormy night. The other riders, who had been still and silent, shifted slightly, their heads bowing almost as one. Martha didn't understand their language, but she felt their emotion like a warm wave around her. These were not the faces of anger. These were faces of relief, of love, of home found again. James stepped outside now, slowly, carefully. He didn't want to startle anyone. He stood beside Martha, and together they watched the leader hold the baby. For a few long moments, nothing else existed. Not the cold, not the snow, not the past. Only the quiet light of torches, the soft winter night, and the small, precious life at the center of it all. Then the leader opened his eyes and looked at Martha. He didn't speak English, but he didn't need to. His gaze said everything. He pressed his free hand against his chest, just over his heart. It was a simple gesture, but it held more meaning than any words could have carried. It said thank you. It said we remember. It said you are not our enemy. Martha felt tears rise to her eyes, warm against the cold night air. She wasn't someone who cried easily, but in that moment the weight of everything she had felt since finding the baby in the storm washed over her. She nodded slowly, placing her own hand over her heart, returning the gesture. The leader gave a small bow of his head. He then turned slightly toward his people. One of the riders came forward carrying a soft fur blanket. It was finely made, with patterns carefully stitched in bright colors. The leader nodded to the rider, who stepped off his horse and offered the blanket to Martha. She accepted it gently, feeling the warmth and the softness between her fingers. It was a gift, a sign of respect and gratitude. James stood quietly beside her. He didn't need to say anything. In his eyes, Martha saw the same thing she felt in her own heart. This night would stay with them forever. After a moment, the leader turned back toward his people. He carefully placed the baby into the arms of a woman who had stepped forward from the group. She looked young and strong, her eyes wet with tears. Martha didn't need to be told, this was the baby's mother. The woman's hands shook as she took the child, pressing it close to her chest, her face lowering to the baby's tiny forehead. She held it as though nothing else mattered. Martha felt her breath catch. This was the moment she had dreamed of in the quiet hours of the night, while rocking the baby to sleep. She had pictured this mother searching the snow, hoping, praying, waiting. and now they were together again. The woman looked up at Martha, and though no words passed between them, Martha saw everything in her eyes. The fear she had known, the pain she had carried, and now the deep, shining gratitude. She took a step forward, holding the baby close, and gave Martha a small, respectful nod. Martha nodded back, her throat too tight to speak. The air was still, almost magical. The stars above shone brighter now, as if they too were watching. The baby stirred again, making a small sound, and the mother whispered softly, her voice like music even though Martha couldn't understand the words. The leader lifted his hand, and the riders slowly turned their horses. One by one, the torches began to move, their lights spreading like fireflies across the snow. The sound of hooves was soft and steady as they began to leave the cabin behind. No one shouted. No one hurried. It was a quiet, graceful departure filled with meaning. Martha stood there in the doorway holding the warm blanket they had given her, watching the figures disappear into the silver light of the night. The last thing she saw was the woman holding her baby close, riding with the leader beside her, the torchlight flickering gently around them. Then they melted into the horizon like shadows swallowed by the dark. When the sound of the horses faded completely, the world fell silent again. Only the soft wind and the quiet of the snow remained. James turned to Martha. His voice was low and warm. "You did something good tonight." She looked at him and smiled faintly. "We both did." They stepped inside the cabin. The fire still burned softly, filling the room with a golden glow. Martha sat down in her chair, the blanket folded gently on her lap. She traced the patterns on it with her fingertips. The careful stitches, the bright colors, the way it carried the warmth of their touch. This was more than just a gift. It was a promise, a memory. James poured 2 cups of warm tea and they sat quietly for a long time, listening to the crackle of the fire. Neither of them felt the need to speak. Words would have only weakened the beauty of what had just happened. They both knew they had shared something rare and real. Outside, the snow glimmered under the moonlight. The cabin felt warmer than it ever had before. Martha leaned back in her chair and closed her eyes for a moment. She could still see the leader's eyes, the woman's tears, and the baby's small, peaceful face. She didn't feel afraid anymore. Not of the unknown. Not of the future. She felt full of something quiet and good. She had always believed that kindness had power, and tonight she had seen it. James reached over and placed his hand gently over hers. "They'll remember," he said softly. Martha opened her eyes and looked at him. "And so will we." They sat there together, the snow outside whispering softly against the window, the firelight dancing on the walls, and a calm peace wrapping around them like a warm coat. The night after the riders left was the quietest Martha had ever known. The wind no longer howled around the cabin, and the snow seemed to rest softly on the ground like a blanket. The stars were bright above the plains, and the air carried a clean stillness. Martha and James sat by the fire long after midnight, neither of them needing to speak. Some nights hold more than words can carry, and this was one of them. Martha gently ran her fingers over the soft, beautifully stitched blanket the Comanche leader had given her. Each thread felt warm, as though it still carried the heartbeat of the moment when the baby was returned to its family. She traced the patterns slowly, her mind replaying every second of what had happened. The leader's steady eyes, the mother's tears, the baby's small sigh. It all felt like something she would never forget, something that would live in her heart for the rest of her days. James sat quietly across from her, leaning back in his chair. The firelight touched his face softly, making him look a little older, a little wiser. He wasn't a man of many words, but Martha knew him well. She could see in his eyes that he felt everything she did. The quiet wonder, the relief, the weight of a moment that had changed their lives. The snow outside glittered under the moonlight. Nothing moved. It was as if the land itself understood that something important had happened here, and now needed to rest. In the days that followed, life slowly returned to its quiet rhythm. Martha woke early each morning to make tea and tend the fire. James chopped wood, fixed fences, and checked the animals, but something inside their small cabin had changed. It felt warmer somehow, not just from the fire but from the memory of what had happened on that silent night. The other settlers in the area soon heard the story. Mr. Collins was the first to stop by again. He climbed off his horse with a curious expression and asked James, "Is it true? They came here, a whole group of them, and left without a sound?" James didn't say much. He simply nodded. "It happened." Collins shook his head slowly. "Never thought I'd hear something like that. 100 riders and not a single shot fired, not a single fence broken. Just quiet." Martha stepped out onto the porch, the blanket folded over her arm. Collins looked at her and then at the blanket. His face softened. "And they gave you that?" "Yes," Martha said gently. "As a gift." He scratched his beard and let out a long breath. "Well, I reckon folks will talk about this for a long time." And talk they did. Word traveled quickly between farms and into the nearest town. People spoke in low voices at the general store, at the church, along the trails. Some spoke with surprise, others with respect. A few didn't understand how such a meeting could have ended so peacefully. But for most, it became a story of something rare, a story of trust where none had been expected. For Martha, though, it was not just a story. It was something she carried in her heart every single day. She often thought about the baby. She pictured it growing up surrounded by its family, playing under the wide open sky, learning songs and stories from its people. She hoped it would live a long, happy life. And maybe somewhere deep inside, a small part of that child would remember the woman who held it close during the storm. James noticed a change in Martha, too. She had always been kind, but now her kindness carried a quiet strength with it. It wasn't just softness, it was something steady, something that came from knowing she had done what was right, even when others might have chosen fear. Sometimes in the early mornings, Martha would step outside and look toward the horizon. She wondered where the riders were now, if they remembered her face, if the leader still thought about that night. She imagined the baby's mother holding her child as the sun rose over their camp. She imagined laughter, the kind that fills the air like music. Those thoughts brought a warm peace to her heart. Winter slowly began to loosen its grip on the land. The snow started to melt, revealing the brown earth beneath. The river, once frozen, began to sing again as the ice cracked and water rushed over smooth stones. Birds returned, their songs echoing through the wide plains. With spring came movement and color, and the world seemed to breathe again. But even as the seasons changed, the memory of that night remained bright. Whenever visitors came to the cabin, Martha would carefully fold the Comanche blanket and place it in a special wooden chest by the fire. She didn't keep it out all the time. It wasn't just a decoration. It was a reminder, a treasure. Sometimes on quiet evenings, she would take it out again, unfold it, and lay it gently across her lap. James would watch her from his chair, smiling softly. She didn't speak when she held the blanket, and she didn't need to. The story lived in the stitches, in the colors, in the warmth that never seemed to fade. The settlers who lived nearby slowly began to see Martha and James in a different light. Before, they were just another young couple trying to build a life on the land. But now people saw them as something more, a bridge between two worlds. They had faced a moment that could have been filled with fear and had chosen trust instead. That choice, quiet as it was, spoke louder than any words. Years began to pass. The land changed with each season. New families came, old ones moved away, and the frontier grew busier with wagons and trails. Martha's hair slowly turned from dark brown to soft silver. James grew slower in his movements, but his eyes stayed warm. And still the Comanche blanket remained in its place by the fire, carefully folded, always ready to remind them of the night their lives had been forever marked by kindness. Every winter, when the first snow fell, Martha would think back to the night she heard the babies cry in the blizzard. She would close her eyes and remember the cold air on her face, the weight of the tiny child in her arms, the quiet strength in the leader's eyes, and the gentle nod of the mother. It wasn't a memory of fear. It was a memory of light in the coldest of nights, Sometimes children from nearby families would visit their cabin and ask to hear the story. Martha would sit by the fire, the blanket on her knees, and tell them slowly, carefully, making sure they understood every part. She would describe the storm, the cry in the snow, and the moment the riders appeared like shadows beneath the stars. But she never told the story as a tale of danger. She told it as a story of hope, a story of how two very different worlds had met one winter night, not with anger, but with trust. And every time she finished telling it, the children would sit quietly for a while, their eyes wide. Then one of them would always ask the same question. "Weren't you afraid?" Martha would smile, the soft kind of smile that comes with years of living. "Yes," she would say honestly, "I was afraid. But sometimes when you listen to your heart, it whispers louder than fear." That was the part the children never forgot. On the 20th winter after that night, Martha sat on her porch wrapped in a shawl. The snow lay soft on the ground. James was inside, making tea. The sky was bright and clear, and the air carried the quiet hum of the wind. As she watched the horizon, her eyes caught something moving far in the distance. A rider. Just one. Moving slowly, calmly. She didn't feel fear. She only watched as the figure came closer. When the rider finally reached the fence line, they didn't come forward. Instead, they tied a small red and white feather to the same post where a feather had been placed many years before. Then, with a quiet nod, the rider turned and rode away. Martha stood there for a long time, the cold air brushing her face. A warmth filled her chest, the kind of warmth that doesn't come from fire but from memory, from knowing that a bond once made had never been forgotten. She walked to the fence and touched the feather lightly, her eyes shining. Time had moved on, but kindness had a way of lasting longer than people ever expected. That winter night so many years ago was still alive, still remembered. When she returned inside, James handed her a warm cup of tea. She smiled at him and sat down near the fire. The feather now rested on the mantel, right above the folded Comanche blanket. She didn't need to say a word. James understood. The snow fell softly outside. The fire burned bright. And in that small cabin on the edge of the plains, a story of kindness continued to live, not just in words, but in hearts.